Face pulls. I love face pulls. I think that they are a great exercise for targeting the rear delts, but a lot of people get very confused at times with face pulls, whether or not you should do them more vertical, more horizontal. Should you be sitting? Should you be standing? What is the best way to target the rear delts? And the infamous answer here is it depends. Depends on the individual, and I find that it also depends on the day. For example, for myself, there are certain times where I feel it so much better when I am in a standing position and or when I am pulling the rope at a more horizontal angle. There are other times that I find I can isolate the area when it is more vertical and when I'm sitting. So it definitely depends on the individual. So my recommendation is to play with it for yourself. Don't be afraid to switch it up at times and don't overthink it. So as of late, I have been finding that a more vertical position and seated is best for me when it comes to targeting the area. So I typically will have the pulley just above my head. That way when I go to sit down and pull the rope, I'm not having to be too far away in a seated position. So when I sit down, I typically will sit on the floor. You can sit on a bench if you prefer. Doesn't really matter. Again, it always just depends. And I really do think that people need to take the time to explore and experiment and just develop a level of curiosity and not let that curiosity overwhelm you based off of what you see on the internet, because people will say, you have to do it this way, you have to do it that way, and you don't have to do anything. Experiment with it for yourself. Make sure you're performing the movement safely and have some fun with it. So I go down in a seated position. As you can see with where the rope is, when I go to let go afterwards, I'm not having it to be super high up where I can't reach. So I can come down in a seated position. So I typically will just stabilize a little bit more by placing my foot on the cable system here. So when we go to pull, the biggest thing that you want to focus on is pulling the rope away from you. A lot of people will just kind of pull it towards their face and maybe have the rope touch your shoulders. I typically like to have the rope above my ears, kind of in between, if you will, and that allows me to really make sure that I'm pulling the rope away from me versus just pulling it towards my delts and pulling it towards my face. Even though the name is called face pull, I still want to pretend that I'm actually pulling it apart versus just towards my face. So in line with your ears and really just pretending, like a good cue is to pretend that you are ripping a shirt open. When you rip a shirt open, you have to pull the sleeves further away from each other in order to actually rip the shirt. So that's typically how I've been doing them as of late. Again, you can do this in a standing position. If you're in a standing position, you want to ensure that your lower back is not doing the work. That's typically the issue that a lot of people have. So when people go to perform the face pull, this is typically a good starting position. However, maintaining this position is where people struggle. So often people will pull the rope towards them, but then they'll kind of jerk their hips further forward like that, right? So that's what we want to try to avoid. And even for myself right now, in order to successfully do this, I can tell I already have to drop the weight. So when you're in a seated position, you have more stability, therefore you're going to be able to lift more. So make sure that if you do change up your positioning, you're comparing different weights, because obviously me sitting in comparison to me standing, even though it's technically the same movement, apples to oranges comparison here. So we're going to drop the weight so I can show you guys how to actually do it. So you kind of want to stand a little bit upright, but I typically will just kind of bend forward a little bit there. And the reason for that is just because I want to target my rear delts. So I'm kind of protracting my shoulders forward versus like having it retracted like this and focusing on pulling. I feel that way more in my back. We want to feel it in our rear delts. So I'll kind of hunch over just a little bit like that, and then make sure that your hips aren't moving. So same thing, the rope is coming towards my ears, not my shoulders like this and not like this. You wanna make sure that you're pulling apart and it's coming up towards your ears. So even though it's not really possible with this short of a rope, the goal with the face pull is to try to get your forearms parallel to each other. So when you come up like this, you want to try to have them parallel to each other like that. So that is going to be a very helpful way to really just make sure we target those rear delts a little bit more versus your fists kind of coming towards each other like that and where your forearms are parallel to the ground. We want them parallel to each other when we are performing the face pull. So that's the biggest goal, as best as you can. A good way to help accomplish that just a little bit better is to use 2 ropes. If your gym has 2 ropes, or if you can snag 2 ropes, this is going to allow you to be able to accomplish that goal of trying to get those forearms parallel to each other. So look at how much more room and range of motion I have by having 2 ropes. So if we're able to do that, when you see here, when I go to perform the face pull, I'll show it from a different angle, but clearly you can see that my forearms are parallel to each other in comparison to being parallel towards the floor. So I'm really pulling the ropes away from each other, really ripping that shirt. Obviously, it's gonna help so much more just isolating the given area. We wanna make sure that our forearms are parallel to each other. We're not pulling like this, and we're not retracting our scapula down, really keeping those shoulder blades rolled forward throughout the whole range of motion and really just trying to make sure that our forearms are parallel to each other. So you can do this as well too if you are sitting down with the dual cable. So same thing here, really just trying to make sure that your forearms are parallel to each other versus just pulling like this. So if we compare that with just 1 rope, not that there's anything wrong with using 1 rope, but as you can see here, even with the cue of trying to rip that shirt open, like it's not too bad, but my forearms aren't gonna be as parallel to each other in comparison to using 2 ropes. So face pulls, great exercise for targeting the rear delts. Like I said previously, experiment with all variations, see what works best for you and what you enjoy the most. Like I said as well too, there are times where I find that I prefer standing, there are times I prefer seated. It doesn't really matter. Just pay attention to what you enjoy the most and ensure that you are progressing with the given exercise, with the given movement pattern. You're good to go.